Hi, I'm Mike Watty from IELTSanswers.com. Today I'd like to talk to you about the IELTS speaking test. In particular, I'm going to give you an overview of the three parts of the exam, and then also I'm going to talk about how the speaking test gets graded. So let's have a look at the three parts of the exam. The whole interview will take about 11 to 14 minutes. 14 minutes is the maximum. Now, in part 1, you'll be asked some general questions about yourself, such as maybe your hobbies, or where you live, or do you work or study. And what you should do in this part is to give short answers to these everyday questions. In total, this part of the exam will last about 4 to 5 minutes long. Part 2, the long answer section, you're asked to give a 2-minute speech on an everyday topic. You'll be handed a card with the topic on it, and then you'll be given 1 minute to prepare for this part. And the key point here is that you should use this 1 minute to think carefully about what you're going to say, so that you can try and talk for the full 2 minutes. Then, in part 3, the examiner will ask you questions about your part 2 topic to form some sort of a discussion. And again, this lasts about 4 to 5 minutes. So if you can give longer answers, you're more likely to score higher, plus you're less likely to get difficult questions that you don't know how to ask. In other words, speaking longer means you get less questions. Now let's look at the grading. You get given a single score when you receive your IELTS results, but actually that score is made up of 4 different parts. And I think if you're preparing for a test, or you're about to take a test, it's quite important to understand what these 4 parts are. So let's have a look at them one by one. Each one's worth 25%. Let me go through them quickly, then I'll go through them in more detail. So the first component is fluency and coherence. Then we have vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. These 4 scores get combined and then rounded down. So what that means is if you get 7, 7, 7, 6, you'll end up with 6.5, not 7, because the score gets rounded down to the nearest half point. So, in other words, to get a 7, you'd have to have 7s in all categories, or if you had a 6 here, you'd need an 8 somewhere in here to balance it out. So let's look at the first category, fluency and coherence. Fluency, it's about being able to speak freely at a normal speed. So to score well on fluency, we should avoid things like long pauses and repeating words that we've already said. Coherence refers to your speaking being easy to understand. One of the ways we can increase our coherence is to use connecting phrases, things like in addition, however, as a result. These sort of words make connections between our sentences and build coherence. Then on to let's have a look at some of the different levels and what you have to do in order to reach that level. To get to a level 7, you'd have to fulfill all 3 of these requirements. If not, your score would drop down to level 6 or below. So let's see what you have to do for a level 7. Speaks at length without noticeable effort or loss of coherence. Okay, so in this case you need to be speaking for maybe 2, 3, 4 sentences without having to pause to think about what you're going to say next, or more importantly, what language you need to use next. Second one, may demonstrate language-related hesitation at times, or some repetition and or self-correction. I think for a level 7 this has to be quite minimal, but in some cases you would be allowed to search, but especially for a more complex word, perhaps you're searching for it. However, this should not happen continuously throughout the exam, otherwise you're dropping down to a level 6. Uses a range of connectives and discourse markers with some flexibility. So that's just like I was saying before, words like in addition, however, as a result. Flexibility, so not overusing words. For example, many people repeat for example too many times, whereas you can use other words that mean for example, such as, or there's one right there, such as. You could also use for instance, especially, and in particular. Especially and in particular are good to highlight an example. Let's say it's your favorite food. I like spicy food, in particular spicy hot pots. Now how about 8? So obviously the requirement is a little bit steeper for this. So if we go back to this first point, speaks at length without noticeable effort, speaks fluently with only occasional repetition or self-correction. Hesitation, pausing, is usually content related and only rarely to search for language. So in this case, you may be thinking of your opinion or response to a question, but you shouldn't be stopping in the middle of the sentence to hesitate to think of what word you need or what sort of grammar you need. Next part, develops topics coherently and appropriately. So in this case, it's very important if you want to score an 8 that you answer the question directly that you've been asked, and also that you develop your answer. You can develop your answer by giving explanations and also giving examples. Then on to vocabulary. Really there's 2 parts to the vocabulary. First part is you should use some high level words, less common words. Second part is to avoid errors, especially with word endings. I've found with many of my students S is a big problem on the verbs and nouns. Be careful of uncountable nouns. And then word endings, often maybe the verbs. Often when the tense changes to past tense, students are often leaving off their ed endings. This counts as a vocabulary error, a word ending error, not a grammatical error. It's a vocabulary error. In addition, you should try to show an ability to paraphrase. You'll see why this is important in a minute. Paraphrase means using, if we didn't know a word, we can have a phrase to replace that. So for example, if I didn't know what a hot pot was in English, what this is called. A hot pot can also be called a steamboat too, which is actually better language. So let's say I don't know what a steamboat is, then I could give some sort of explanation. It's like I suppose it's like a soup with lots of vegetables and perhaps meat or seafood thrown in. And we should also try to use some colloquial language. Colloquial language, very similar to slang. Be careful you don't use any dirty slang. The examiner probably won't appreciate that. And not only that, you're in a formal to semi-formal situation, so it's not appropriate to use things like the F word. So what sort of words can you use? Well, instead of saying you lost your job, you could say you got fired. That sort of thing is what I mean by colloquial language. So let's see what you have to do for a level 7. Level 7 uses vocabulary resource flexibly to discuss a variety of topics. So flexibility is about using different words, not repeating the same word over and over again, even though it might be a good word. Try to phrase things differently. Try to use different word forms. If you've been using the word as a noun, then why not use it as a verb to show the examiner your talent for a word? So you might have been talking about management, now you can talk about managing. Also uses some less common and idiomatic vocabulary. Obviously for an 8 you need more, but for a level 7 you need to use some less common and idiomatic vocabulary. If you didn't have any, you're dropping to a 6. So do build up some idiomatic vocabulary. And I don't so much mean common idioms like raining cats and dogs. That's not really going to impress the examiner. You need to come up with, I don't know, so like I mentioned before, like getting fired instead of losing your job. Not being able to stand spicy food instead of not liking spicy food. This is what I mean by idiomatic vocabulary. Then shows some awareness of style and collocation. Collocation is about words that go together. For example, we talk about tall people, tall buildings, but if we're talking about nouns that are conceptual or abstract, we use high, like high salary, high intelligence. We wouldn't say, I have a tall intelligence. Does say with some inappropriate choices. So level 7 you're allowed to make some mistakes. Last part, remember I mentioned paraphrase. Uses paraphrase effectively. You need to try and show the examiner you can paraphrase. One of the ways you can do this is pretend you've forgotten a word and then later you can remember it. So for example, we know the word steamboat, we're talking about eating it, but instead we say, oh, last night for dinner I had a, I've forgotten what it's called in English, but it's kind of like a soup with lots of vegetables and meat thrown in. I remember, a steamboat. Okay, so it's forget, paraphrase, remember the word. Okay, so very important to try and show some ability to paraphrase in the exam. It's an important skill. Then level 8, what do you need to do? Uses a wide vocabulary resource readily and flexibly to convey precise meaning. I would also add to that correctly. It's fantastic if you use a high level word, but if you use it incorrectly, then the effect is not so good, sending your score lower. Uses less common and idiomatic vocabulary skillfully with occasional inaccuracy. So again, you're allowed to make some mistakes with some of this idiomatic vocabulary because it is difficult. Let's say 1 or 2 times in the 14 minutes that you're having the interview. Uses paraphrase effectively as required. So again, we should try and show the examiner that we have the ability to paraphrase. And certainly this is what you want to do. If you can't remember a word or you just don't know it, then you should use paraphrase. You should use some way to explain it. Let's say it's smartphones and you don't know how to say smartphone in English. You could just say, it's one of those cell phones that you can surf the internet and do other things with. Surf the internet's idiomatic vocabulary also, by the way. Alright, moving on to grammar. Again, 2 key points. You need to use a variety of sentence types. Simple sentences, compound sentences, which is linking 2 clauses with a conjunction, and, but, so, for. And also complex sentences. You can form these by using things like conditionals, if phrases. If I win $1 million, I will go to Hawaii. You can also use the relative pronouns, who, which, that, where, to add a clause onto your sentence. The other side is to avoid grammatical errors. Some of the common grammatical errors I've found with my students: articles, a, an, and the. Try to avoid these errors. Try to cut them down. Learn how to use the articles. And prepositions, in, on, at. These words can be troublesome too. You may want to do some quizzes on those. I do have quizzes on my website if you want to practice these. Then let's see what you need to do for a level 7. Level 7 uses a range of complex structures with some flexibility. Okay, so complex structures, and then in this case you may be overusing certain ones, but still there are a range of complex structures. Second part, frequently produces error-free sentences, though some grammatical mistakes persist. So in this case you need to be having 3 or 4 sentences in a row without errors frequently throughout the exam to get to a 7 for grammar. If every sentence has an error, you won't get level 7. You might get a 6, but probably more likely you're going to be looking at a 5 for your grammar. Then what do you have to do to get an 8? Uses a wide range of structures flexibly. So in this case you shouldn't be overusing any one particular structure. Even though conditionals are great, you shouldn't be using too many of them in your speaking. Even though it's good to use the passive to show the examiner your talent, in theory passive is usually used when we don't know the subject or when we want to highlight the object. So that's how you should be using it for a level 8. Then produces a majority of error-free sentences with only very occasional inappropriacies or basic non-systematic errors. Okay, so now you need to really be having let's say about 80% of your sentences should be error-free. Errors that are in there should be non-systematic. That means they shouldn't be reoccurring. For example, if you have troubles with the articles, if you are constantly missing out the in your sentences, that would be a systematic error. That would send you down to a 7. It's hard to get 8. Pronunciation. 2 real key parts to this too. The first part is that you can make all the sounds in the English language, and that it's easy to understand what you're saying. The listener, the examiner, does not have to work hard to catch what you're saying. Then the second part, especially if you want to score higher, if you want a 7, if you want an 8, or even a 9, then you need some features of a native speaker, such as intonation, which is the tone of our voice going higher and lower. For instance, if we ask a yes-no question, our intonation normally goes up. Do you understand? And stress. Stress is where we emphasize our key words. And rhythm. English just has a natural rhythm when we speak it. It's largely a result of intonation, stress, and perhaps also connected speech, where we join two to get words together, like do you want to, do you wanna. Then let's see what we have to do to get our grades. Level 7 really requires all of level 6 plus at least 1 of level 8. So let's have a look at level 6 first. Uses a range of pronunciation features. Uses a range of pronunciation features with mixed control. So you're using intonation, you're using stress, but not always correctly. Shows some effective use of features, but this is not sustained. So especially with long sentences, you may lose some of your rhythm. You may lose some of the stress on the key words. Can generally be understood throughout, though mispronunciation of individual words or sounds reduces clarity at times. Reduces clarity at times. For me, I think most people should be able to get to a 6. If you can't be understood, are you ready to go overseas? Perhaps not. So I think everybody should work hard to get to at least level 6 here. Okay, so if you fulfill all of these, you get a level 6. If you do all of these and one of these, you can get to a 7. Let's see what you've got to do to get to an 8. First one, uses a wide range of pronunciation features, so intonation, stress, connected speech would start to be helpful here, using words like wanna for want to, or we got wanna, gonna, shoulda. This would be helpful, not essential, but certainly you should be using stress and intonation to highlight the key points in your speech. Sustains flexible use of features with only occasional lapses. So in some instances the intonation may be a little bit off. Next part is easy to understand throughout. L1 accent, that means your first language. Has minimal effect on intelligibility. So you're allowed to still have some accent. If you're from China, you may be speaking English with a Chinese accent, but the key point is the intelligibility. It should be easy for the listener to understand what you're saying. You might be from other countries, India. I'm from New Zealand. We have an accent as well. Sometimes we're not very intelligible in what we're saying. We're lazy with our vowels. Instead of saying 9, we say like 9, and 6 like sucks, and famous one, fish and chips. So New Zealand accent not always intelligible. Maybe I'd only be a level 8 or a 9, I'm not sure. But the key point is that even though you have an accent, you should be easy to understand throughout. There should be no difficulty for the listener to pick up what you're saying. So that brings us to the end of this video. I do have some other videos on speaking on YouTube. You can look for those. You can also go to my website where I've got more information about the speaking exam, along with some strategies and vocabulary that you can use in the speaking test. Also welcome you to contact me down here, mike@IELTSanswers.com. Welcome to ask me questions. I do have a service of providing students with lessons over Skype if you wanted to practice your speaking or get some feedback on how well you're speaking, or even try a mock speaking test. So if you're interested in any of those things, you can take a look on my website, or you can send me an email. Hope you've enjoyed this video.